Hello guys, welcome to ChessCuber. In today's video, I'm going to share with you the basics of how to play chess. If you're new to chess, don't worry. This video is designed to be easy to follow and understand. And if you are already familiar with the game, you might still pick up some useful tips and reminders. In this video, we will be covering the fundamental rules and concepts of chess, from setting up the board to checkmating your opponent. So let's get started. Understanding the board. Let's take a closer look at the chessboard. The chessboard consists of 64 squares, arranged in an 8x8 grid. The squares are usually colored in a checkered pattern, with light and dark squares alternating. It is essential to understand how the board is laid out, as this will help you navigate the game. Notice that the board has rows and columns, labeled with letters and numbers. The rows are labeled with numbers 1 to 8, also known as ranks, while the columns are labeled with letters A to H, also known as files. This will help you identify specific squares on the board. Knowing the pieces. Each player has 16 pieces in total. 8 pawns, 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, 1 queen, and 1 king. Orienting the board. First, make sure the board is oriented correctly. The square in the bottom right corner from each player's perspective should always be a light-colored square, and is referred to as white on the right. Setting up the pieces. The setup of the pieces is crucial, as it determines the starting position of the game. Let's go through each piece and where it's placed. Rooks. The rooks go in the 4 corners of the board. Knights. The knights go next to the rooks. Bishops. The bishops go next to the knights. Queen. The queen goes on her own color. For white, that's the D1 square, and for black, it's the D8 square. King. The king goes on the remaining central square next to the queen. For white, that's the E1 square, and for black, it's C8. Pawns. The pawns go on the second rank, row directly in front of the other pieces. Remember, the setup of the pieces is the same for both white and black, except for the color of the squares. Now that we've covered how to set up the pieces, let's go on to movement and capturing. Movement is how a piece changes its square on the board according to specific rules. Capturing is when a piece moves to a square occupied by an opponent's piece, removing that piece from the board. Let's start with the pawns. This is the initial setup of the pawns. Pawns move forward, 1 square at a time. But each pawn on their first move can move 1 or even 2 squares forward. Pawns are the only pieces that cannot move backward, but they are involved in 2 special moves which will be explained towards the end. Now let's see how pawns capture. Even though pawns move forward vertically, they cannot capture a piece directly in front of it. Pawns capture diagonally 1 square forward. Here the white c4 pawn captures black's d5 pawn. Black then played c6. Now white has 3 options. Move the d5 pawn forward, or capture the c6 pawn, or to do nothing and move something else. It's a tactical decision to be taken considering the position of the game while playing. Here white decided to capture the c6 pawn. Black then recaptures the white c6 pawn with pawn b7. Also note, when 2 pawns are directly opposite to each other, they are blocked. They cannot move unless there is any of the opponent's pieces diagonally to be captured. That's all about pawn movement and capture. Now let's move on to the knights. The knights are the most unique and interesting piece in chess. The knights move in an L shape. 2 squares in one direction, and then 1 square perpendicular to that direction. A knight always lands on a square of the opposite color from its starting square. That means if it starts on a white square, it will always land on a black square. Here's an example of how knights move. Let's move on to how the knight captures. The knight captures an enemy piece by landing on its square. Now let's see how the knight on e5 can capture the rook on g1. In this case, it requires 2 moves for the knight to capture the rook. Knights are the only piece that can jump over other pieces, whether they are friendly or enemy pieces. It does not capture any pieces it jumps over. It doesn't matter what's in the way as long as the destination square is empty, or occupied by enemy pieces to capture. But the knight cannot move to a square if the destination squares are occupied by its own pieces. Knights are most powerful in the center of the board, where they can reach up to 8 different squares. In the corners, they are limited to only 2 possible moves. Now let's move on to the bishops. Both players have 2 bishops at the starting of the game. Each bishop is restricted to squares of the same color as its starting square. This means that a player has 1 light squared bishop and 1 dark squared bishop, which remains in the same colored squares throughout the game. Let's see how bishops move in capture. Bishops can move any number of squares diagonally forward or backward. Bishops cannot jump over other pieces, whether friendly or enemy. Now let's see how bishops capture enemy pieces. Just like their regular movement, bishops capture along diagonals by moving to the square occupied by an opponent's piece, and the captured piece is removed from the board. That's it. Now let's move on to the rooks. The rook is a key piece in chess, known for its powerful straight-line movement and capturing abilities. Let's see how they move. Rooks move any number of squares horizontally or vertically. Think of their movement like a plus sign on the board. They cannot jump over other pieces. Now, let's see how rooks capture opponents' pieces. A rook captures an opponent's piece by moving to the square it occupies. This removes the captured piece from the board. To capture a piece, it must be in its direct unobstructed line. Here's an example of how rooks capture. In this case, it requires at least 2 moves for the rook to capture the bishop. Now, let's move on to the powerful piece on chess, the queen. The queen is the most powerful piece in chess, due to its versatile movement capabilities. Let's see how the queen moves in captures. The queen combines the moves of a rook and a bishop. It can move any number of unoccupied squares in a straight line, horizontally, vertically, and diagonally. The queen cannot jump over other pieces, whether friendly or enemy. Its path must be clear, similar to the bishops and rooks. Capturing. The queen captures an enemy piece by moving to the square that the enemy piece occupies. The captured piece is then removed from the board. That's it. Now let's move on to our most valuable piece, the king. The king is the most important piece, and protecting it is key to winning the game. Let's go to the king's movement. The king can move 1 square in any direction, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. This means it can only move to adjacent squares. Capture. The king can capture pieces within its 1 square range. However, there are some important restrictions to keep in mind. Firstly, the king cannot move into check. This means it cannot move to a square that is under attack by an opponent's piece. In this case, the king cannot move to the green arrow marked squares, because those squares are under attack of the rook. Secondly, the king cannot capture defended pieces. If an opponent's piece is protected by another piece, the king cannot capture it, because the defending piece in the next move can capture your king and game over. Lastly, the king must maintain a safe distance from the opposing king, because our king will be captured in the next move by opponent's king if it's near, and it's game over. You have already mastered how every single piece moves across the chessboard. Before we talk about winning or drawing a game, we will go through some unique and incredibly powerful special moves. They are castling, pawn promotion, and en passant. Let's explore these special moves one by one. Castling. Castling is a unique and powerful move in chess that involves both the king and one of the rooks. It's the only move in chess where two pieces are moved in one move by a single player, and it's primarily used to enhance king's safety and activate a rook. Now, let's see how to perform castling. The king moves 2 squares towards one of its rooks on the same rank, and the rook then jumps over the king and lands on the square immediately next to the king on the other side of it from its original position. There are 2 types of castling depending on which rook is used. If the king's side rook is involved, it's known as the short castling, and if the queen's side rook is involved, it's known as the long castling. In both situations, the king moves exactly 2 squares, and the rook covers the king, but in order to castle, there are certain conditions to be followed. The king and the rook used should never have moved in the game. There should not be any pieces in between the king and rook. The king must not be in check, and the squares the king passes and lands should not be under opponent's attack. It is permissible for the rook to be under attack or to pass through an attack square. Only the king's safety is considered in these specific rules. Pawn promotion. Pawns are the only piece that cannot move backwards. So what happens when a pawn reaches the last rank? Pawn promotion. Pawn promotion is a crucial and exciting rule in chess that allows the seemingly weakest piece to become a powerful asset. Here's how it works. When any of the 8 pawns reaches the opposite side of the board, it can be exchanged for any piece you want, except a king. For example, if all 8 pawns reach the last rank, then the player can have 8 queens, rooks, knights, or bishops of their choice. En passant. Let's now move on to the final special move, en passant. This is a special pawn capture that can only occur immediately after an opponent's pawn moves 2 squares from its starting position and lands directly alongside your pawn. Your pawn can then capture it as if it had only moved 1 square, but to be captured in the very next move, or else the right to capture is lost. The endgames, how to win or draw a game. As you've mastered the movement, capturing, and the special moves of each pieces on the board, let's move on to the 3 most important concepts of outcome in every game: the check, the checkmate, and the stalemate. Let's begin with the check. When a player's king is under attack by an opponent's piece, it's said to be in check. This means the player must take immediate action to protect their king. A player can get out of check in 3 ways. 1. Move the king to a safe square. 2. Block the check with one of their pieces. 3. Capture the attacking piece. Now, as you have learned how to check the opponent's king, let's move on to checkmate. Let's dive into the most exciting and conclusive moment in chess. You know about the immediate threat of a check, but what happens when that threat becomes inescapable? Checkmate. This is the ultimate goal, the scenario where the king is under attack, with no legal moves to escape. That means if a player's king is in check, and there is no way to get out of check, the game is over and the player loses. And that's called the checkmate. Let's have some examples on how to deliver and recognize this winning position. As you can see, the king doesn't have any escape square, as the queen is attacking the only available square. Also, the king cannot capture the queen, as the queen is supported by the bishop. Here the black king is checkmated, and white wins. Now let's see another example. Let's go as a game. White plays pawn to f3, and black responds with pawn e5. Now white moves the g2 pawn to the g4 square, and the black queen rushes to the h4 square and delivers checkmate. In this case, the king is in check, and there is no way for the king to move out of the check. And so white loses and black wins the game in just 2 moves. Let's see another example. Here, the rook moves to the e8 square and delivers checkmate. This checkmate is delivered in the last rank where the king is stuck to move by its own pawns. So this checkmate is widely known as the back rank mate. We have mastered the art of checkmate. But what happens when the king is trapped, and it has no safe squares to move, and not in check? Also, none of its other pieces can move either. It's called stalemate. It's a draw. Here are some examples of stalemate. As you can see, the king is trapped in the corner with white to move. It is safe in the square where it is now. But the king has no legal moves to make, as the queen is attacking all its possible squares. And the pawns are also stuck with no legal moves. And that's what's called a stalemate. The game is a draw. But if this was the case with king having no legal moves, but the pawn on e2 has legal moves, here it's not a draw. The pawn must move. Let's just see an example with this pawn movement. The pawn moves forward. King moves to f3 and pawn moves to e4. And the king captures the pawn. Now the white king has no legal moves even though it's white to move. But it is safe where it is. So it's a stalemate. Besides stalemate, there are several other ways a game can end in a draw. Let's explore them. Draw by agreement. A draw by agreement, also known as mutual agreement, is the most common type of draw. Either player can offer a draw after making their move. If accepted, the game is declared a draw. Threefold and fivefold repetition. A draw can be claimed if the same position occurs 3 times during the game. This rule prevents endless repetition without progress. A common example is perpetual check. Also, if the same position occurs 5 times, the game is automatically a draw, even if not claimed. 50-move rule. If no pawn is moved and no piece is captured for 50 consecutive moves, a draw can be claimed. This rule prevents games from dragging on indefinitely. Insufficient material. A draw occurs if there's not enough material to checkmate. Examples include king versus king, king and knight versus king, etc. That's it for our comprehensive guide to the rules of chess. Now you've mastered the rules of how to play chess. I hope you found this video informative and helpful. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned player, chess is a game that's all about improvement and growth. So keep learning, keep practicing, and most importantly, have fun. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to ChessCuber for more chess tutorials and insights. Checkmate.